We've still got some people coming in, friendly faces and familiar faces. Welcome everyone to the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre War Studies Seminar. Just a bit of housekeeping. If I could ask you to turn your phones onto silent or turn them off, and I'll do the same thing. We don't want any of those going off. We are recording this evening's event, so if you wish to go back and listen to it later or tell your friends about it, we will link to it from our Centre's website. For those of you who are new to the War Studies Seminar, we hold this every couple of months, and we've been doing so since last year. And the aim of the seminar series is to bring, so far, new research and new opinions to a wider public. And we tend to have some up-and-coming historians do that, but I think by reading Gary's bio tonight, you'll know, and his own reputation, you'll know he's not an up-and-coming historian. And he really is one of the world's leading experts on the First World War. For those of you who aren't aware, there's been quite a public debate in the UK last year and earlier this year by politicians, media personalities, and some people with really no idea at all on the origins of the First World War, and especially the allocation or the lack of allocation of blame. Tonight's speaker was one of the few credible voices in that debate on Twitter, radio, TV and public lectures and seminars like this one. I mean, he tells me he had 4 seminars or public lectures just in the week before he's come over here to Australia. And Gary's really sort of delved into that public debate and given it some sense and some accuracy. So we're very lucky to have him here tonight, particularly in the absence of any similar debate in this country, which is quite remarkable given the hundreds of millions of dollars that are about to be spent on the centenary of Anzac and that are already being spent. So perhaps there might be some questions to Gary about that and similar funding in the UK in question time. Without any further ado, I'll ask Professor Gary Sheffield, the Chair of War Studies at University of Wolverhampton, to take the stage. He'll speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. We'll have questions until 7 o'clock. And then Gary has other prior commitments, so we'll have to let him go straight away afterwards. Thank you very much, Gary.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thanks very much, Reece. It's a real pleasure to be here. I always like coming to Australia. It's actually my 9th time here. I added it up for checking my passport stamps on the way over. I think it's the first time I've been to ANU actually, so I've broken new ground this time. Well, as we've just heard, the topic of the origins of the First World War, which frankly has been sort of, academics have debated over the last few years, but it was pretty much a consensus, has been turned upside down really since 2012. With the emergence of a quite a vociferous attack on the standard narrative of the origins of the First World War, which really from, shall we say, the late 1960s onwards tended to put the blame at the door of Germany and Austria-Hungary. And my title contains a reference to the most important of these sort of new revisionist books, The Sleepwalkers, a book by actually the Australian-born Cambridge historian Christopher Clark, who reinvigorated the debate in all sorts of ways. As you might gather from my title, I don't wholly, or indeed at all, agree with the thrust of his argument. But I must say I must pay tribute to that book in certainly reinvigorating the debate. But the arguments contained in this book, or at least some of the arguments and some of the other things that have come out recently, take us back actually to at least the 1930s. Because writing in his memoirs in that decade, David Lloyd George, of course British Prime Minister for the second half of the First World War, asked the question, how was it the world was so unexpectedly plunged into this terrible conflict, the First World War? And he answered his own question. It had been, in effect, a tragic accident. Nobody wanted war, Lloyd George said, but nations backed their machines over the precipice. And various other historians and statesmen at the time made similar arguments. Right, should put that one up earlier, apologies. Sidney B. Fay, for example, an American historian writing in 1929, said this: "No one country and no one man was solely, or probably even mainly, to blame for the outbreak of the First World War." And Fay went on to condemn the so-called war guilt clause of the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, which stated that the aggression of Germany and her allies were responsible for the war. Now, this is far more significant than simply a semi-retired politician, which Lloyd George was at this stage, sounding off, or for that matter, an academic writing from his ivory tower. Because these views that the war was accidental, in fact, struck at the meaning of a conflict which had killed millions. If the war was accidental, did that also mean it was preventable, and by extension that those millions had died for nothing? The result of an appallingly destructive war was a post-1918 world which was, to put it mildly, less than ideal. And this fed into a sense of futility, that the war had simply not been worth fighting. And I think it's reaching back to this sort of consensus of the 20s and 30s as what has happened with the publication of The Sleepwalkers. In this book, Christopher Clark says this: "The outbreak of war in 1914 is not an Agatha Christie drama, the end of which we will find the culprit standing over a corpse in a conservatory with a smoking pistol. There is no smoking gun in this story, or rather, there is one in the hands of every major character. Viewed in this light, the outbreak of war was a tragedy and not a crime." Various other historians have followed this line. So Richard J. Evans, another Cambridge historian, has argued what he said was it's time to get away from the blame game. And Margaret Macmillan, actually a Canadian Oxford-based historian, devoted over 600 pages of a book to discussing the origins of the war without really coming to a firm view of who was to blame for it. Well, all historical writings, of course, must be judged in the context of the period in which they are produced. By the time that Fay and Lloyd George were writing, a reaction to the war had set in. The Treaty of Versailles was discredited in some quarters, reviled by British and American liberals as too harsh, and of course undermined by the economist John Maynard Keynes in his influential polemic, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And I think Lloyd George's war memoirs, no less than the writings of Siegfried Sassoon, belong to the category of disillusion, of the literature of disillusionment. The fact that Lloyd George had been Prime Minister, as opposed to an infantry subaltern, doesn't matter. This was actually a matter of disillusionment. Well, in a similar way, we in the West are now coming to the end of basically almost a decade and a half of engagement in the Middle East, in which the application of military power has, I think, led to widespread disillusionment with the idea you can use military force to make things happen in the way that you want it to happen. And I wonder whether we shouldn't place this new idea of going back to the First World War as being, in effect pointless.